So today I'm going to be covering an introduction to biological recording. So many of you may have been involved in biological recording and not even have realised that you have. And so we're going to look at what it is. We're going to focus on iNaturalist as a way to get involved with biological recording, just because it's an accessible way and it's a growing kind of tool. So hopefully you should understand what it is and what iNaturalist UK is, if you ever hear that sort of term, and then a basic understanding of how to use the iNaturalist app and touch on the website. So both can be used to share your sort of sightings of species, and then know the best practice tips for using iNaturalist. So to make sure that your data can make an impact and can be used by researchers and those working in the conservation field. And following on from that, hopefully develop a basic understanding of what actually happens with your biological records when you're sharing them through the example that we're looking at as iNaturalist. So a quick bit about me. So I work at the National Biodiversity Network Trust as the data officer and also the iNaturalist UK lead. So for the charity's been around for the last 20 years, or 25 years even, since 2000. And we have been trying to make data work for nature. And this is mainly since 2017 through our data portal, the NBN Atlas. So this is a UK-wide portal that collects biodiversity data, so the sort of biological records and that we're going to touch on today, including from iNaturalist and other apps, but also from organisations. So records that the public might collect through apps, but also those from structured kind of surveys or campaigns like the Big Garden Birdwatch from BTO. These organisations can share their data and we support them with that to the NBN Atlas. And this is a portal that anyone can use. So whether you're a member of the public or you're working in the conservation sector, you can use it maybe to find what's recorded around you and learn about your local nature. And then I'm also a biological recorder in my free time. It's something really fun and addictive to get involved with and learn about the nature around you and improve, just take notice of the nature and learn more about it and know what you're sort of looking at. So to start off, I'm going to look at, well, what is biological recording? So biological recording is, as I've said, a really accessible way to volunteer your time to help nature. So biological records can be used to inform how species are faring and inform their conservation. So this sort of data can be used to know where species are, where they aren't, maybe how they're interacting with their environment and how we can support them and sort of inform that those steps that need to be taken to look after and protect those species. It can also be useful to learn about the nature around you. So as I've touched on, we have at the NBN Trust the NBN Atlas, which you can use to look at the records around you, but also as you're involved with biological recording and maybe you're recording the wildlife and plant species, the animals in your garden or your local green spaces, it allows you to take notice of those organisms and learn about the nature around you in your local space. To be involved in biological recording, a really nice thing is that you don't have to be an expert. Everybody starts somewhere. You can maybe you start off with one group and you can start to improve your skills in identifying what you're looking at and recording that species, or it might be that you just record everything in your local sort of patch and build your skills that way. And as I'm going to touch on today, there are these apps with iNaturalist that give support with species identification to help point you in the right direction and can actually be a tool to help you develop your skills and be able to be more confident in knowing what you're looking at. So when you're involved in biological recording, you create what are called biological records, and So what a biological record is I've got an example here for this buttercup picture of it's a what, a when, a where, and then who sort of recorded it. So the what being the sort of the organism. So you can record sort of species, a term that you might hear a lot, but you can also record sort of, at lower level. So for this example, I've put that it's a buttercup. So maybe I'm not very confident in recording buttercups. So there are more than when you say buttercup, you're referring to a group of species of buttercup. So there's more than one species of buttercup, but you can still record it and it's still useful information. And you can say that it's one of those species. So again, touching on how you don't need to be an expert and maybe you improve your skills as you go along and are able to identify it down to that species sort of level. The what is also whether you've actually seen the organism or the species, but you don't have to see the species to create the biological record. A biological record can also be of the evidence of that organism being there. So, for example, with birds, you often hear and you don't see them as much as you do hear them. So you can still record it, but you can say that you've heard the bird song. So maybe that's something that you note down that you heard the bird song rather than seeing the bird. Or a good example, for example, for mammals might be that you see their footprints. And so you can record this sort of the evidence. You don't actually have to see the species to be able to create a biological record for it. Then we have the when. So this is the date of when you've seen it. You don't have to record, and a lot of biological recording has been going on for a very long time, and the UK is one of those nations that has sort of been leading that. And we have, compared to other nations and countries, we have a lot of biological records from like the 1600s. So we've been creating and building this picture for all this time. So some of those records, for example, might not have a specific date. It might be that you've seen it in May 2000. It's still a when, but it's better to be as specific as you can, and we'll come on to why that is when we're looking at how people use your records, and it helps motivate you to try and make sure that your records are of good quality if you are sharing them onward and using apps like iNaturalist. So then we have the where. So if you're recording in your garden, you might put the street name and record that down as the where. So you don't have to put your exact address. The more specific you can be, the better. But obviously within like the remit of what you're willing to share if you're sharing your record onward. But also say if you're in a local reserve or a local park, you could also record that the name of that reserve or park as the location. Now, Ordnance Survey grid references are a really good way to record location because it gives a bit more of a accurate pinpoint type location. So it'll be like a grid square of maybe 1 meter or more, and that's a common way that people have been recording locations for biological records in the UK, and it's quite specific to the UK. But with as well, you might be aware of what 3 words. So that might be something that you can record in terms of a 1 meter grid square, but it's just having that reference. With a lot of apps these days that you can use to get involved with biological recording, you've already got that tool where it's, your phone's got that GPS device inside and it can record the latitude and longitude. So again, that nice pinpoint location to somebody to refer to where that you've seen this organism or seen the evidence. And then the who is simply you as the recorder. And this is just good reference again if you are sharing your records onwards, which is good to do. If you're taking the time, it's good to share those records just to know who has recorded that species so that you have that traceability. But it also helps with, for example, down the line, if you're sharing your records, when experts are looking at your records, either using them or helping to verify them, which helps improve sort of confidence in the data, they can know who it's came from and who's recorded it. And then in terms of, there are lots of ways to actually create those biological records. So as I've touched on, there are lots of apps, but you can create a biological record in an analog way in a notebook. And this might be a nice way to do in your garden, and take that time away from screens if you want to improve your identification without the support of apps maybe, and test your skills. But it's good to try and digitize those records. So for example, you might put them into a spreadsheet on your computer, and this allows you to then share your data. So what next are you going to do with your biological record. So a good example and a good place to share your records with is local environmental record centres. So these are organisations. So some of them might be independent charities, some sit within councils, or some of them are actually just volunteer sort of groups, depending on their setup. But they hold data for sort of a county level, and then people can access. So maybe local researchers or uni students can go to the record centre and get the data. But also they're a good source for planning development. So ecologists will typically go to an environmental record centre and request like what's known as sort of a site search, and the record centre can give the ecologist this report on like protected species and habitat. So that's why it's good to share your sightings onto a record centre, because your records can be used to try and help protect your local nature. So that's a good one to share them with. You probably will have sort of local species groups around you as well, who are involved in biological recording and focus on one sort of group. So for example, that might be a local mammal group, a local bat group, there might be a sort of butterfly group, or they're called sort of county recorders that collect data on that county level for a specific group of species. But local record centres, species groups might get the records from local record centres. So you can always sort of ask local record centres if they're sharing the records or not, or the species groups if they're using the records, and ask them if you want to share your data. And then moving on, obviously I've touched on apps quite a bit already, with sort of touching on iNaturalist. So the good thing with apps is that you have that tool, again, as I said, that gets your location information for you. You haven't got to have a GPS sort of tool with you to maybe get a grid reference, which is quite good. And then it's digitizing those records already, and that those biological records will be stored either for if you're using an app, like for example the big butterfly count, they'll store that data. When you're involved if you've used apps like that, you've been involved with biological recording and you've helped create biological records for that organisation, and they might use it to inform how species are doing. So like the big garden bird watch, they use those records to inform how species are doing. And then hopefully they should share those records on for further impact. So for example, the BTO who run the British Garden Bird Watch will share that data on with us onto the NBN Atlas. So it's available for the wider network. Again, if you're somebody locally wanting to see what's around you, you might do a search and see that, but also those working in conservation and those experts. So what actually is iNaturalist and iNaturalistUK? So iNaturalist is a California-based non-profit organisation, and they originally developed the iNaturalist app as or website and platform as a master's project, and then they have recently developed into this non-profit organisation, and they maintain the iNaturalist website and apps. So you can upload and use both of these tools to share what they call observations. So this is like an interchangeable sort of term. So observation is the same as record. It's just sort of different terms, I guess, because they're based in California. So they use different terms. And so they are sort of facilitating the collection of biodiversity data on a global scale. So because they are working on collecting and engaging people on a global scale, they have a sort of network of what are called nodes. And so the NBN Trust, the National Biodiversity Network Trust, is the lead for the UK node, alongside the Marine Biological Association and the Biological Records Centre. And we are helping to engage the UK with iNaturalist and support the UK user group, as well as helping to make sure that the data is being used in the UK and engagement with the data, and tackle any sort of UK specific issues that are preventing the data from being used. Within the iNaturalist family, there is also an app called Seek, which is good if you've got young children, because you don't have to create an account and it doesn't create the record, so you're not necessarily involved in biological recording when you're using that app, but it's a good way to engage younger children, and it has the tools that iNaturalist does in terms of species identification. So that's just something within the iNaturalist family to be aware of. So the reason, obviously, we're one of the leads for iNaturalist UK, so that's sort of why we're focusing on it. But also there are many pros to iNaturalist compared to other apps. So as I've touched on, some apps are specific for certain species. So for example, it might be butterflies or mammals. So with iNaturalist, you can record any species or type of organism. So you haven't got to have lots of different apps. And then the app and the website as well, if you were using the website, have what's called a computer vision model, which provides those suggestions on when you take a photo of, or you're pointing your camera at something, that it can give these suggestions of what it thinks it is, which again is really helpful if you're new to biological recording and species identification. It's also, obviously, as this is a global app, it's another sort of pro that when you're off on your travels abroad, you can use the iNaturalist app, and you haven't got to get another app, and you're helping to contribute to conservation in those different countries, and also keep like a list for yourself of what you're seeing across the world, not just in the UK, and it's all in this one place. A unique thing to iNaturalist is there's this community aspect. So when you upload an observation, and you are also able to do this as well, other users are able to suggest identifications on other people's observations. So when you upload something, and for example, you say it's a daisy, somebody can come in and maybe they can say, oh, this is actually a common daisy. Or if we look back at that buttercup example, somebody might be able to get it down to species level and suggest that. So it's a way for you to learn, and it also actually trains the computer vision model. So it's a very community based app, which is quite nice. And you're also able to leave sort of comments on people's observations. So some people might do this to say, like, oh, nice photo, or share about what this record can help, like a particular project or that you might be interested in. So it's more than just an app to be involved with biological recording. It's also got a nice community aspect. So I'm just going to give a little overview of how to actually use iNaturalist. So I'm going to focus on using the app. The website follows a very similar structure in terms of the steps that we've got here on the presentation slide, but the app is good in terms of you can be out and about and you can create those records, compared to if you're using the website, you would have to take the photos. Either like if you're using a camera, it might be good, or if you're using your phone, you take the photos and then need to put them onto your computer, your device, and then upload them that way. So it's sort of not as good for like on the go recording. So that's why I'm going to focus on the app mostly today. So the first thing you'll do, so to highlight, there are two versions of the app. Because iNaturalists are quite a small organisation, they're in that sort of developmental stage of they're trying to bring the two versions of the apps up to date. So the iPhone app looks quite different to the Android version of the app, but the premise is the same in terms of taking a photo and uploading it and the information that it stores. So I'll try and touch on the differences between the apps, and hopefully it'll be still useful, and regardless of which device you're using. So when you download the app, you'll create an account, and this is just so that obviously people can contact you again if they have like queries on your records, as I touched on earlier. And there's that traceability to the record. So you'll download the app and you'll create your account, and then what you'll do is you'll take a photo. You can take a photo, and this is probably the most common way that you'll use the app. So for the Android app, you'll have this little plus notification, which is at sort of the bottom of the screen. And then if you're using the iPhone app, you have this sort of camera icon that we've got on the screen that you sort of click on, and then it opens up the camera and you sort of take a picture. The difference with the two apps is that the iNaturalist Android app doesn't give live identification suggestions, whereas the iPhone app does. So you'll turn on the camera and you'll see that it's giving suggestions. So you can also upload sound, as I've touched on. That, for example, birds. You often might want to record sound. So you can, if you click on the plus icon for the Android app, you can say upload a recording or create a recording. And then for the iPhone app, you would hold that camera button and it would give you the more options, and you can click to record sound. The thing to note with iNaturalist is it doesn't give suggestions for audio recordings, but there are other apps out there, and many of you may have heard, for example, of Merlin, Bird ID app. And you can actually, if you're using that app, you can share your recordings. There's like a share button, and that can be shared to the iNaturalist app if you've got it on your device. It's like a nice succinct way to share that recording onto iNaturalist, and then you can add the information about where the where and the when onto that recording and what it is. So I've got a little video, two videos here. So the first one is showing the Android app. So here I'm taking the photo, and then if you're not happy with it, you can click the retry and you'll do it again. You can also upload more than one photo by clicking that camera and the plus icon at the top. So I've clicked on here, suggest IDs, and you see here you've got, so it's saying it's pretty sure it's in this genus, so that's a group of species, but there are these other ones below. But if you're not confident, it's good practice to pick the kind of lower level identification. So here I'm showing how the Android app allows you to explore and compare. So we've got a picture of what it looks like and then that map. And then when you're happy, you select that identification. And then if we look at the iPhone version of the app, you'll see that you're getting, so this is from the iNaturalist guides, hence the sort of American species, but you're getting those live identifications at the top of the screen. So you'll click it and it will come up with a screen and it will say, we think this is what it is. And it also gives a confidence level, which is a nice addition to the iPhone app. So then once you've created the identification with the Android app, it will take you to what's like the edit page, as we've just seen in that video. So if I sort of go back a bit, we've got you'll see like behind the preparing the photo, you've got the date you can see, and then there's also the location information. So it's good just to check that information is correct. With the iPhone app, when you're new to the app, it uses something called a standard mode. So you'll take the photo and it just creates the observation for you. So it's good to go, back to the home page, and then you'll have like the list of your observations. So it's good to click on the most recent observation that you've just created and check that information. So it'll have the same information as the Android app. It'll just look a bit different, like in terms of the design. But it's good just to make sure that your phone has recorded the date correctly. It normally has, but mainly that the location is correct, because sometimes your GPS can be a bit off. So you can sort of click on that location information and it will show the map of where it is and the pinpoint. So it might be that you need to move it around, but it's just good practice to make sure that the location is accurate, as I say, because sometimes your phone can be a bit off. For example, if you're in a woodland, sometimes the signal can be a bit awry. And then you will upload your observations. So with the Android app, once you've added that information, you'll click the tick button and it will be uploaded, which is a bit different to the iPhone app if you're using that standard version where you have to click onto it, like it uploads it automatically. But there is, if you want it to look similar to the Android app, you can go into the settings and select to have it in advanced mode and have the edit page as your default kind of view, so that when you take a picture or you upload anything, it will take you to the page that looks similar to the one that we've just seen on for the Android app. And then it's good to check back later on your app or on the website to look at your observations and see if people have suggested IDs or agreed with you. And once so many people have agreed on your observation, it becomes something called research grade. You might see pop up on a term used on the app when you start using it, if you're not already. And this is essentially just to say that the community has agreed on that ID, and you can just have a bit more confidence in the record. So, as I've said, we've touched on there, making sure that your location is correct. It's good to make sure that your observations, as it's called in iNaturalist, but your records are working for nature and that people can use them. So there's a few things that can act as barriers to your records being used. So when you create an iNaturalist account, um, your data, your records will have something called a license, and this is by default. This is a Creative Commons license that prevents commercial use. And unfortunately, this can prevent a lot of environmental record centres that I touched on earlier, who you can share your records with, from using your records in sort of reports for planning applications, for example, because it can be interpreted as non-commercial. So it's really good if you can set the default license on your account for your records or observations, as they're called in iNaturalist, to be this CC0 license, and it just means that there's no restrictions on your records being used. And so the easiest way, you can do this within the app, but it's a bit tricky because the two apps are quite different. So just to help, I'm going to show you how you can do it on the website. So you would go to this link, so this takes you to the UK iNaturalist website. And then if I play that, you'll see, so this is your home page. When you go on the iNaturalist, you'll pick edit. You'll also see here that you've got display name. So I touch here that you've got, it's good to have your name on there if you're comfortable with it, so that people can have more confidence in your records. It's something that people like in the UK. And then, so I've scrolled down to the license and I've clicked that CC0. And if you're already using iNaturalist and you've uploaded observations, you can click that update existing observations with your new license choices. So it will be applied to your any old records that you've made, so that those can be used. You can also set licenses for your, like, the photo or the sound recordings, but these aren't as important. So you can set what's called the CC BY license, which basically means that anyone can use your records, but they have to credit you. So that might be something that you're more comfortable people doing. So it's also good to try and take good, clear photos. So I've just got an example here that I've learned through being involved with biological recording on. So with plants, it's good to try and get a picture of the flower, like from the up view, and then from the underside of the flower and like the leaves. So for this example of the buttercup, so the first image is the image that I used earlier in the webinar, and I couldn't identify it down to a species level. You could only really say that that was a buttercup. But by having those picture of the underside, it's you'll see these sort of reflected pieces, they're called sepals, these reflected parts here. They're folded backwards, and this is an indicator that it's a bulbous buttercup. And then if you get a picture of the leaves, this further sort of improves this confidence. And even if you're not sure what it is, by taking those photos, somebody who knows what to look for can suggest it, or maybe even it can help the computer vision model from iNaturalist to suggest the right species for you. And then it's good as well, good practice to try and record different species. So if you're going to a local space or you're recording wildlife or nature and animals and plants in your garden, it's good to not just try and record, for example, distinct, nice looking flowers. It's good to try and record everything that you see. So also the invertebrates, just to get that wider picture of what's going on and what's actually present where you're recording. Another nice aspect to iNaturalist is this community aspect, as I touched on earlier. So these aspects, there's things called iNaturalist projects which help collate data into one place, and so a lot of organisations might use this as an engagement tool, and they set up things like that you may have heard the term BioBlitz, and it's for a set amount of period of time that you just go to a place and you record everything you can. And it's a nice way to collate those records and see the impact. And then you're able, as I've touched on, you're able to help identify, and other people can identify your observations and help you improve the quality or confidence in your observations. So both of these things can be done in the apps, but they're a bit easier to look at on the website. So that iNaturalistUK website or iNaturalist website. So you might find that there's two websites, so you can use either. The difference with the UK specific website is just that records are filtered just to the UK, which is just helpful so that you don't have to do that extra step if you're using the website to explore records. So the project here, so the way you get to it if you're on the website is that you click on the community drop down and then projects, and then it'll bring up a home page, and you can see sort of featured projects, for example, that are going on. So, for example, if you're living on the coast, there's the Rockpool project. They use iNaturalist and projects quite a lot to run these BioBlitzes to try and record the species and engage people. And they have like a leaderboard and things, which is quite fun. And then if you want to identify, you've got this sort of identify page that you can do, and it's just designed a bit more nicely and easy to navigate to like look at people's records. And this is a good way to improve your identification skills, but also contribute to the wider community. So there are a lot of observers on iNaturalist, but nowhere near as many people actually contributing identifications. And you don't have to be an expert on this. And iNaturalist ran a webinar and was sort of pushing this a month or so ago. So there's this QR on the screen, or the link on a webinar that iNaturalist ran on becoming an identifier, and they highlight how you don't have to be an expert. So some people might upload observations and upload it without any sort of identification. And then this means it's trickier for those that do help with identifications or are experts to find those records. So it might be that it's a bird and someone's left it as just unknown and they've just uploaded it. But you can go in and say, oh, I know that this is a bird, and it helps other people find it. So you're still helping to contribute. So now just moving on to, well, what happens next to your records. So this diagram on the screen is quite sort of complicated, but it just shows how iNaturalist sits into that. There's a whole wider ecosystem of biodiversity data in the UK and how it's being used and how it can come from all sorts of different places. So it's just where iNaturalist or like iNaturalist UK fits in to that wider picture. So when you're using iNaturalist, your records are globally available for scientific research or local conservation. So, for example, helping to inform and understand a species distribution, as they share their research grade records. So when the community have agreed on an ID to this platform called the Global Biodiversity Information Forum, so that's GBIF, that green thing on the box in the diagram, and they're like a global version of the NBN Atlas. So it's collating data on a global level, but we also help feed iNaturalist UK data into the NBN Atlas via iRecord, which is another recording app that you might want to use. And this is iRecord is where our sort of UK experts verify the data. So it just improves the confidence in the data and how useful it can be and how people can rely on it even more. So it can also, when you're sharing, you're protecting your local nature. So as I've touched on, you're helping to inform local planning applications potentially via your records being shared with your local record centre. And local record centres can go and download records from iNaturalist as well. So that's how they can get those records. And then iNaturalist is also becoming an emerging tool for detection of non-native species. So there was a recent example where there was a lace fly in London that hadn't been recorded before, a non-native species, and DEFRA were able to see this, and it was brought to their attention, and then they were able to carry out the necessary sort of action and steps to monitor that species. So this is why it's good to make sure that your records are good quality, make sure that the location is correct and the date, and that it's got that sort of correct ID. So, not giving it an ID or identifying other people's to a species level when you're not sure, just because your data is feeding in, and it's the better quality it is, the more useful it can be to help your local nature. So that's everything sort of for today. So as a recap, hopefully now you should understand what biological recording is, in terms of that a biological record is the recording of a what, where, and when, and who has made that record. Hopefully you should have an understanding of what iNaturalist is, that it's this app and this non-for-profit organisation. So they also have that website. And then we have and what iNaturalistUK means, in terms of that it's that UK specific node to help engagement and support UK users. And then, yeah, a basic understanding of hopefully how to upload your first observation if you've not used the apps before, and also a little bit on the website and the extra sort of tools and the pros to having a look on the website, and then those best sort of practice tips. So checking your location is accurate, checking your data is sort of accurate, taking good photos, having that open license so people can use it, and taking nice clear photos. And then finally, hopefully I've helped sort of, develop a basic understanding of what actually happens to those biological records when you create them, like where do they go from iNaturalist. So yeah, hope everyone found that helpful and a good and useful introduction to biological recording.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Rhiannydd. I think it was a really good overview on exactly how to use those records and how people in the wider kind of conservation and environmental sector can use them as well. Um, so thank you so much for that. We do have quite a few questions in the chat already. So I'll start with a question from Adele. And they have asked, how do you find the local environmental record centres that you discussed at the very beginning?
So a good way to find the environmental local record centres is via something called Alert Finder, and I'll share the link um, so that you can include it with the resources afterwards. But if you type in sort of Alert Finder, it brings up like a map, and you can enter like where you are, an address, and then it will find your record centre, and it will have a web, hopefully should have their details, so like their website, so that you can find out more about them and look at their website on how to share your records if that's how you'd like to do it, or just find out more about them.
Brilliant, thank you. And then we've got a few questions from Amy regarding kind of what format you put into things like iNaturalist. So they've asked initially what the success rate of kind of iNaturalist um suggestions when it comes to IDing things like bones, scat, and mammal tracks, and whether sound recordings are just as valuable as photos.
Yes, so in terms of the yeah the iNaturalist suggestions, they sort of work better in some places than others. So there's for example, there's certain species that they do really well in, but for example, there's earthworms where it likes to suggest thing like a worm and say that it's an earthworm, but it's actually sort of not. So that's why it's always good to, if you're not sure, to choose that more kind of lower level identification, even if iNaturalist suggests it, just sort of, and you'll get to know this as you use the app, and from getting from people when they're sharing about, you're getting feedback from people using iNaturalist and they're giving you suggestions. You can learn yourself. It's a tool and it's learning, so it's always good to be cautious. And in terms of like recording other evidence and it giving suggestions, it's probably not the best app in terms of recording and giving suggestions on sort of animal scat or bones, just because because it's quite vast and it's looking at lots of different organisms. It's it's what it's sort of trained on. So maybe over time, if more people do upload, then it might be better. But there might be other apps out there that are more designed to that, and hopefully they share those records onwards. And sound recordings are just as good. So as I say, you've got Merlin, which is really good, and it allows you to share your recording onto iNaturalist. So it literally just uploads the audio file, and then you're able to say what Merlin was saying it was. And then people that know what they're listening to. So for example, a lot of the time I record bird sound and upload it to iNaturalist, and people can listen to it, and if they know what they're listening to, they can still suggest IDs. So it's still a good way. If you can't get a picture of something, it's still a good way to record the sound, and it'll often still become sort of that research grade. I do it quite a lot. A lot of people just aren't aware that you can record sound and upload it to iNaturalist because the focus is on the uploading the photos, because obviously the app gives the suggestions rather than with sound.
No, that's really handy. I wasn't aware of that link either. So that's really good to know that you can the two apps kind of interplay. We have got so Amy's just raising her hand. If you want to unmute Amy, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Rhiannydd. With the um, bird recordings on iNaturalist, can you identify multiple species in one record, or do you need to, for birds, do you need to create multiple observations with a recording for the individual species that you're hearing in order for it to be the most valuable observation?
Yes, so it would be as individual. So it might be that you upload the same recording, so you sort of can duplicate the records, and that is like a feature. I know in the Android app there's sort of a select, and you can say duplicate, and then you can just go in and then select the species, and that's just so that the record is like of one species in one place. So that is the sort of the best way to do it. So it only allows you to add an identification for one type of species, compared to obviously Merlin tells you for that audio
Mhm.
file what it's heard. But for biological records, it's typically a what, a single what, and
Mhm.
a what, where, and when. So
So
yeah,
if you had
hopefully
a
that's
one record or one recording that had a robin and a wren singing, we'd upload it once to iNaturalist, say it's a robin, upload it again and say it's a wren. Is that correct?
yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
that's great.
because it's
Thank
got
you.
that. Yeah, it's okay if it's got the robin in there. Obviously, people will listen and say,
Yeah.
oh, I can hear the wren." I do it quite a lot. That with birdsong, there's often more than one species singing in there. But if you can take the time to upload them as multiple observations, then that's really good, because obviously it means that each species will be recorded then.
Okay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Amy and Rhiannydd there. So we've got a couple more questions. So somebody has kind of answered this already, but I'm going to put it to you, Rhiannydd, just to see kind of what your answer is, and I guess to get an understanding of how you kind of deal with the playoff between the two. So Gail has asked whether all recording apps use AI, as she knows that iRecord does, and she's a little bit worried about using them because of obviously the environmental considerations
Mm.
around AI. Um, yeah, that's Gail's question.
Yes, so I suppose with iNaturalist, so it's sort of yeah, that it's that model that's sort of training itself through the community. And obviously AI does have that impact, but iNaturalists are obviously quite aware, they're trying to help conserve biodiversity, so that's in their mind, in the most sustainable way to use that tool. So it obviously, it has its payoff, its sort of pros and cons, in terms of it's really good for starting out to help. So for example, like Merlin ID is really good because it can be quite hard to get to know birdsong, and it's these AI tools are becoming quite good. But depending on like how you feel, if you'd rather not, they are really good tools, and as I said, the organizations are obviously trying to do the best that they can in terms of sustainability. But you can always, as I said, you can always record in an analog way, or but record them in a spreadsheet and share them with your environmental record centre. So it's not the only way to be involved in biological recording, and maybe you can have a look at sort of ID guides. Or there's so many resources online these days with websites that are free if that's sort of a problem, but it's whatever you feel sort of comfortable. There's no sort of one way about it. There'll always be that option to do which, to share your records and be involved how you wish.
Yeah, thank you. It seems like AI is kind of infiltrating everywhere. So I think it is going to, like you say, become one of those things where you have to weigh the benefits for the negatives and yeah, how to work around those is a tricky area, especially in conservation. So we've got a couple more questions, if that's okay. So Adele has asked, so you showed that lovely diagram of all the different ways that the apps and the kind of data feeds into all the various kind of recording schemes and such. Adele's asked, do all of the various apps, so I guess things like Merlin, etc., do they all feed into the NBN Atlas, or is it just the ones that were displayed on that diagram?
Yes, so it's, as I said, it's sort of what we're covered is a very basic understanding of what actually happens to your record. So it's quite complicated. So unfortunately, not all apps the data will be shared to the NBN Atlas, which we work on. It's sort of up to and down to the organization. So it might be, it's often down to sort of resources. It's quite a lot they might collect their data in one way, and then it takes a lot of time to store the data and transform it in a way that it can be shared on to us. In terms of, and as well, the global apps like Merlin, it's sort of a globally used app. So don't necessarily share to the NBN Atlas, but Merlin is connected to something called eBird, and that's another way to record. So you create things called checklists. So if you're into birding, you can create like a checklist, and it creates sort of a biological record in terms of it records where you're walking. So you start it off, and it stores that data. And I believe they share that data onto GBIF. So that's that global sort of version of the Atlas. So they do share the data onwards, but there are some examples where the data isn't shared. But that's something the NBN Trust is we are trying to do, is try and make that data accessible. So when you're involved in these big sort of campaigns around recording certain species, that you can access that data quite easily, through a platform like the NBN Atlas, and it's not sort of stuck behind or just stuck with the organisation. So it can be used, as a member of the public to learn about what's actually around you, but also, other organisations can make the most of that data.
Brilliant, thank you. And then one last question, which I feel will be quite a subjective answer. But Alison has asked, which is the best overall site to record on? They currently use various kind of iRecord sites and CoughNod, which I've not heard of before. But yeah, I guess in your opinion, which one would you recommend?
So yeah, I think it's hard to recommend because it depends on you and what you want to record. And as I've highlighted, sometimes iNaturalist, as I've said it, you can record everything, but sometimes it's not the best app to use. So, for example, if you want to share with your local environmental record centre, like CoughNod, so that's the North Wales Record Centre, for those that aren't aware, they've obviously developed this app to try and get data to them as quickly as possible. So for record centres, they're quite small, so sometimes it might be a bit tricky to get the data off platforms like iNaturalist. Again, just because they've got to try and get it into their format for their systems, and they've got to have the time to do it as well as getting the data directly to them. So it's it just depends on like who you want to get your data to. And then it's as I say, like on the earthworm things, if there's certain species where it's good, maybe that I record, or different apps might be better because their their model or their sort of AI tools haven't been confused. So like with the earthworms, a lot of people have, or worms, a lot of people have said, yes, that's an earthworm, and that's why it's sort of got stuck on that. So it's a lot of people, like for example, I might use lots of different apps. So it's just finding what works for you, and then trying to work out what sort of happens to your records. So if you're not sure, you can maybe always ask the organisation for the app. So if you're using iRecord, the records will come to the Atlas. So the difference is that if you were using iNaturalist, it goes from iNaturalist once it becomes that research grade to iRecord, and then iRecord, the Biological Record Centre who maintain and have built that, the iRecord app, and that's also a website, facilitate the sharing to the NBN Atlas. So it's, yeah, it's not I haven't really answered your question, but it's, yeah, if you find that your apps work for you, then that's fine. It's just that iNaturalist is a nice tool app to get started with you if you're new to biological recording.
That's great, thank you. Um, I think that's all we've got time for today. So I just want to say a huge thank you for everyone for joining us today on hopefully a sunny afternoon. Um, and I hope you've all got the tools that you now need to go and make all those amazing records. And then I just want to say thank you as well to Rhiannydd for this wonderful talk and giving all those tips and pointers and kind of a really good introduction to iNaturalist because it's essential that we keep recording nature so we know exactly what's around us. So thank you for your wonderful presentation, Rhiannydd.